nice to be able to look out and see some faces that are familiar to me. It's always a little intimidating when you go someplace new and you're not used to the pulpit and you're not sure whether the mic is going to work and all that kind of stuff. So I can trust that this is all going to work out. We shall see. Oh my. One of the things that I have discovered about holiday seasons, aside from the fact that it's when family come together and all of that kind of thing happens, is that there's always a marathon of the Twilight Zone. I don't know if you've been watching it or not. It's kind of part of my childhood, so I kind of have to do a little bit of it. But one of the episodes that I watched and seemed to go with what we were talking about today was one in which there was a street salesman who's always sold needful things. And anyone who came up to him, he would tell them what it was they really needed. And he would sell it to them. And sometimes it wasn't really what they wanted, it was just what they needed. And that's kind of how John's gospel works here. The Israelites, the people of ancient Israel, the Jews, had received the law. They had received that, they had worked with it, they had found ways around it. And now they were going to get a gift that they hadn't really expected to get. And they weren't entirely sure it was what they really wanted, and yet it was a needful thing. I don't know if you have ever done much comparison between the various Gospels or not. The first three are called the Synoptic Gospels, and they basically provide a blow-by-blow account of Jesus from birth to death. John doesn't do that. And one of the questions you might ask is, well, why is that? Why is John not like the others? And it's simply because John is the last of the Gospels to be written. It was written probably towards the end of the first century, and by that time, many things had changed. It was no longer a fledgling community of Christians. They were now spread all over the Mediterranean world, thanks to Paul and others. They had begun to develop their own sense of polity and theology, and they also were beginning to ask, well, what's next? And I think John is trying to answer that in this opening chapter to his gospel. Eventually, he'll talk about some of the things that were part of Jesus' ministry, things that were familiar to us, although there's sometimes a little twist because John is a bit of a curmudgeon. What you'll find, though, is that he's very interested in where does the church go from here? Aren't you a little tired now of the Nativity? It's time to put the Christmas tree up. It's time to stop singing Christmas carols. It's time to start thinking about, well, where do we go from here? And so he starts from the beginning. Curiously, he begins with a creation story. Now, why in the world would he do that? Well, let's think about it for a second. If you are working in first century Middle East and the Mediterranean world, there are lots of gods. It's still very much a polytheistic world. And a lot of these gods have large followings, and how do you compete? One of the things that the ancient Jews had always had to do was also explain why their God was better than the others, why their God was the only God. And they had done that throughout the Old Testament with creation stories, not just the one in Genesis. But, well, today we read part of Psalm 104. That's a creation story. If you read Ezekiel 37, the story of the dry bones, that's a creation story. They're filled with these kinds of stories. And over again, what you find is the idea of a pre-existent, all-powerful God who really needs no introduction, but who is always in command of things and who is assisted by his word. Now, in the Genesis account, of course, the word is simply what God says, let there be. In the Ezekiel story, God tells the prophet Ezekiel to prophesy to the word and then eventually prophesy to the breath to bring back these dead bodies. But in this particular case, John is introducing who his God is. It's a new movement. We have to make sure that people know who we are so that you'll have a better understanding of what we have to offer and why it's different from other people's gods. And so we start with simply, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Now, if we were doing this in my class, we'd be doing a little Greek here too, and you would be learning that what we're finding is that the beginning, arches, was the Word, ho logos, and the Word was with God, ho theos. And in each case, what we're doing is we're using the definite article before each of these things. So we're particularizing them. It's not a God, it's the God. It's not a word, it's the Word. Because these things are particular. They are distinctive. They are important to us. And God was with the Word. And he was in the beginning with God. Now, you've got to be careful here. The idea of the Trinity had not yet developed in early Christianity. That'll be down the next century or so. And so what we are doing here is we are melding together attributes of God and allowing those attributes to have a new purpose, something that has to be explained for these people to get some idea of what's going on. And that is so different than the Genesis of creation, where you have this pre-existent singular being who does everything and who is in charge of everything and who controls everything. Even though some of the words in the Hebrew text, including the word tahom, are actually references to other gods and other creation stories. And in essence, capturing those, taking them away from their original roots and making them part of the new Hebrew story, making their God the God. I was tempted to read it in Hebrew, but I decided I'll just wait. Oh, what the heck. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim et haaretz. So magnificent. It's nice to hear. It may be the only time you'll hear it, but what the heck. Although, I can tell you, I always tell my students, you want to know this stuff? Learn Hebrew. And I get the same reaction. Oh, well. So, if we then turn to the John account, all things came into being through him. And without him, not one thing came into being. We are also capturing the elements of creation here. What has come into being in him was life. And I would suggest to you, it's not just the life of creatures that live their life, but it is in fact eternal life. What we're getting now is a new package, a new opportunity, something that has not been offered before. And the life was the light. But what is the light? We're equating things here. The Word and the light are the same, and we're going to have another equation in just a minute. But in this particular case, the life was the light, and that light is knowledge. It's a new understanding, a capacity for love and understanding that is given to every person. And it's up to us then to decide what we're going to do with that. And then he gives a summary statement. The light shines in the darkness. But what was the darkness? The darkness was lack of knowledge. And the darkness did not overcome it because the light was too powerful for it. Erica, thank you for leaving the globe on. That's very helpful. And then all of a sudden, John the Baptist is injected into this. Why do that? Well, again, first century Christianity. John the Baptist was a leader of a movement before Jesus began his ministry. Remnants of that movement undoubtedly still existed and may have been a challenge to the early Christian movement. It was important that John be put in his place and given his proper role. He is not the light. He is not the Word. He is the one who testifies to these things. He is the bridge from Judaism into Christianity. So there was a man sent from God whose name was John, and he came as a witness to testify to the light. And what does it mean to be a witness? It means he already was a believer, and as such could speak with veracity and with the ability to convince people of this. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. John is the first Christian in many ways. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to that light, and the true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. Now there is your acknowledgement, at least, of the Annunciation, of the Nativity story. But that's as far as John's willing to go. His interest is not in that event. His interest is, where do we go after that? When the light comes into the world, what happens next? And so he, the light, was in the world. And the world came into being through him, that is, through the Word. Yet the world did not know him. Why not? Why not? Why didn't they know him? Well, to begin with, of course, we're talking about an insignificant little country that was dominated by the Romans. Why should anybody know him? But by the time that John writes his gospel, that word was beginning to spread. And all of a sudden, it was important to explain where it came from and where it was going. Yet the world didn't know him. He came to what was his own. One of the themes that you find in the Gospel of John has to do with that original mission to go to the Jews. They were the original chosen people. They were the ones who had received the law from Moses. They were to receive this word first. And there's a wonderful conversation between Jesus and a Samaritan woman in chapter 4 that you all ought to have a look at, because she brings up that very point, and Jesus argues with her about whether or not it was important for her to hear the word, because it was supposed to go to the Jews first. And her answer is very clear. Even the dogs are allowed to eat crumbs. We all are entitled to hear the word. And he came to those people, and they did not accept him. Now, it's not just the Jews, it's anyone who doesn't hear the word. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, another equation with the light, he gave power to become children of God. Now, that's a special term. It's used very seldom in the New Testament. When it is, it has great power. In the Greek, it's teknatheo. But these are not children born of women. They were not born of blood or of the flesh, but of the will of man, or not of the will of man, but of God. This is a special group because they are those who hear the word, who act on the word, who believe and transmit the word on. That's the mission. That's the role of the church. Without that word being communicated, it has no power. And so their role is, like John's, to testify to their belief in God's only Son. And Jesus has now entered the world. In verse 14, the Word became flesh. Or actually, the Greek is better translated, in flesh. And lived among us. And we have seen his glory. The glory of a Father's only Son. Again, a special term, monogenes, full of the recipient of grace and truth. Okay. And the question, again, is, why was this necessary? We have the law. Isn't that enough? Well, apparently not. It wasn't getting the job done. And so a special dispensation was necessary. God needed to be part of creation. Not above it, but part of it. Sharing its feelings, its pains, its emotions, Because how can you understand the creation if you are not a part of it? And the result is Jesus becomes flesh. But why is that necessary? Well, the next verse tells you. Because no one has seen God. No one. Not even Moses. You got to see God's backside, but that wasn't quite the same thing. But in seeing Jesus, in hearing the word, and having it transmitted down through the generations, the assurance of God's care is found in that moment of incarnation. Without the incarnation, there is no Christianity. Because it is that moment beyond command, beyond the Ten Commandments, beyond the law, in which we share purpose and share the world together so that we, in fact, become those children of God. And we acknowledge that Jesus is God's only Son, while at the same time recognizing that God is pre-existent and part of God from the very beginning. So what have we been given? We have been given the greatest gift of all. Grace is a gift, and that grace allows us to participate in and advance the movement that was started with John's acknowledgement of Jesus. And if you go on and read the rest of the book of John, what you'll discover is that there are a whole series of identifications of Jesus there. He starts as the Word. He is further identified as the light. He is told to be the one and the only, and finally, simply, the Son. And for that we are grateful, and for that we have received that needful thing. Amen.